Chapter 1. The abandoned quarry stretched before Sera Blackwood, its depths filled with stagnant water that reflected the Copper Street sunset. At 23, she had learned to read the sky's warnings, the subtle shifts in wind that preceded the ash storms sweeping down from the scorched mountains. 2 years of isolation in the Ember Wastes had taught her what her flight never could. Survival meant trusting your instincts when everyone else called you defective. Her breath misted despite the desert heat as she knelt beside the water's edge, filling her leather canteen. The wind had been calm at dawn, barely disturbing the hood of her patched traveling cloak. Now, hours later, the horizon had darkened to the color of old blood. Ash clouds gathered above the mountain peaks with threatening speed. Sera corked the canteen and secured it to her belt alongside the dried lizard meat she'd caught that morning. Her stomach cramped at the thought of another week of rationed meals, but hunger was familiar. Hunger was survivable. The alternative, returning to the flight and the whispers that followed defective sparks, was not. "Time to move," she muttered, the words rough from disuse. 2 years of speaking only to herself had made conversation feel foreign, even the internal kind. The first ash flakes began falling as she shouldered her pack. They were large and heavy, the kind that heralded the storms that could flay skin from bone if you were caught exposed. Sera's dragon stirred uneasily beneath her skin, a faint presence that had always felt hollow. Even now, after years of solitude, her dragon remained barely aflutter when it should have been her inferno. She remembered the awakening. 21 years old, surrounded by her entire flight, standing in the ceremonial circle while the scorching moon bathed the canyon. Every shifter present had watched as she called her dragon forward, as she begged the creature to emerge fully and claim its place in the sky. Instead, what came was a weak, fractured thing. Wings that flickered in and out of existence, never fully manifesting, never fully retreating. Scales that appeared and vanished like mirages. The flight elders had looked upon her with pity. The younger dragons had looked away entirely, unwilling to acknowledge such weakness among their own. "Spark," they'd whispered. "Broken." Sera shook off the memory as she started back toward her shelter. The ash fell harder now, thick flakes that obscured the familiar path. She knew these wastes regardless, had walked them in every season, every weather. 8 miles separated the quarry from her home, a cave system she'd fortified against the elements. She could make it in less than 3 hours even in a storm. The wind picked up, howling through the canyon walls. Within minutes, the gentle ashfall transformed into a blinding maelstrom. Sera pulled her scarf over her nose and pressed forward, each step deliberate. Panic helped no one. Her mother, Kestrel, had taught her that before her death 5 years ago. The memory brought the familiar ache to her chest. She'd been the flight's scout, the one who could navigate territories that left others lost. Respected, valued. Sera had been her apprentice, learning the properties of desert plants and the way to track prey across sand that showed no prints. Then came the accident. A sandstorm, they'd said. She'd been caught in the open while scouting near the glass flats. Her body had been found at the canyon's bottom, broken beyond even the flight healer's considerable skills. Sera had been 19, grieving and alone, when the flight alpha had summoned her. Alpha Talon of the Iron Scale territory had requested a mate. A political alliance to secure mining rights and trade routes. The Alpha had chosen Sera, perhaps because she was already broken, already a disappointment. What did it matter where such a dragon was sent? Her brother Garrett had begged her not to run. "You'll die out here alone," he'd pleaded, gripping Sera's hands the night before the binding ceremony. "Please, just do this. Just survive." But Sera had seen the way Talon looked at her during the betrothal feast. Hunger and contempt mingled in his expression, the look of a man who'd been offered damaged goods but would take them anyway. She'd fled into these wastes that same night, choosing uncertain death over certain misery. Garrett believed her dead now. The thought twisted through Sera's chest every time she allowed herself to remember. Her brother was 25, probably mated himself by now, probably ashamed of the coward sibling who'd abandoned him to face the flight's judgment alone. A sound cut through the storm, pulling Sera from her spiraling thoughts. Not the wind. Something else. Something alive and in pain. She stopped, turning slowly, eyes straining against the grey wall of ash. There, barely visible through the storm, a dark shape moved. Massive. Four-legged but wrong somehow. A dragon, then, but enormous, far larger than any natural form. A monarch, perhaps, the rarest and most powerful of their kind. The dragon stumbled, legs buckling. It collapsed into the ash-covered ground and went still. Sera's breath caught. Sense screamed at her to keep walking, to reach her shelter before the storm killed her. But her feet carried her forward, drawn by something she couldn't name. As she approached, details emerged through the ashfall. Crimson scales, shot through with gold, matted with blood. Wounds covered the dragon's flanks, deep gashes that smelled wrong. Nightshade. And something else, metallic and deadly. Iron. She knelt beside the massive creature, breath visible in rapid puffs despite the heat. This close, its sheer size was overwhelming. Easily 3 times the mass of any shifter she'd known. A monarch, certainly. A powerful one. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, knowing the unconscious dragon couldn't answer. Her hand moved of its own accord, reaching toward the blooded scales. The moment her fingers made contact, fire shot through her body. Not painful, but shocking in its intensity. Power surged up her arm, through her chest, igniting something deep within. Her dragon, that weak and fractured presence, suddenly roared to life. For the first time in 2 years, Sera felt complete. The sensation vanished the instant she pulled her hand away, leaving her gasping and confused. She touched the dragon again, and again power flooded through her, strength she'd never possessed filling her limbs. "This isn't possible," she breathed. The storm intensified, wind threatening to knock her sideways. She needed to decide now. Leave this dragon to die, or somehow get it to shelter. The creature had to weigh at least 4 times what she did. There was no way she could move it. Except when she gripped the dragon's foreleg, that impossible strength returned. Her muscles didn't strain. Her legs didn't buckle. She maneuvered the massive body onto her shoulders in a movement that should have been laughable, and instead felt natural. Sera stood, the dragon's weight pressing down on her, and began walking. 8 miles. She had 8 miles to cover in an ash storm while carrying a dying monarch. Her mind screamed that she'd fail, that she'd collapse halfway and suffocate beside this stranger. But her body disagreed. Each step came easier than the last, as if the contact with the dragon's scales channeled strength directly into her bones. Her dragon sang within her, more present than it had been since the failed awakening. Whatever this creature was, whatever power it possessed, it called to something fundamental in Sera's nature. The journey blurred into gray and heat and relentless forward motion. Her world narrowed to the next step, then the next, then the next. Time lost meaning. Distance lost meaning. Only the warmth of the dragon's body against her shoulders remained real, an anchor in the chaos. When her cave finally emerged from the storm, Sera nearly wept with relief. She shouldered through the entrance, dragging the dragon inside, and collapsed beside it on the stone floor. Her body shook from exertion and heat exhaustion, but she'd done it. 8 miles through a killer storm, carrying a creature that should have been impossible to move. She forced herself upright, stripped off her soaked cloak, and turned to properly examine her unexpected guest. In the dim light from her banked fire, the dragon looked even larger. Blood stained her floor where it lay. Those wounds needed immediate attention, or this creature would die regardless of her rescue. Sera grabbed her supplies, the herbs and tools her mother had taught her to use. Her hands moved with familiar precision, cleaning wounds, packing them with poultices that would draw out poison. The nightshade was bad enough, but the iron mixed with it created a compound that would kill even the strongest monarch. "Who were you running from?" she asked the unconscious dragon, her voice barely audible. "And why do I feel like my life just changed forever?" The dragon's breathing was shallow but steady. It would live, at least through the night. Whether it would thank her for the rescue or curse her for interfering remained to be seen. Outside, the ash storm howled its fury against the cave walls, sealing them both inside. Sera added dried dung to the fire and settled onto the floor beside the massive creature. Her body still thrummed with residual energy from the contact, her dragon more alert than it had been in years. Tomorrow she would have questions. Tomorrow she would demand answers. But tonight, as the storm raged and the strange dragon's chest rose and fell beneath its gold-streaked scales, Sera allowed herself one small truth. She was no longer alone. And somehow, terrifyingly, that changed everything. Chapter 2. The dragon did not wake on the first day. Sera changed the poultices 3 times, her hands moving with the precision her mother had drilled into her during years of training. Each time she peeled away the herb-soaked cloth, she expected to find the wounds unchanged or worsening. Instead, they looked better. Not healed, but closing faster than any injury should, especially ones contaminated with nightshade and iron. "That shouldn't be possible," she murmured, pressing fresh desert sage and sandroot against the deepest gash along the dragon's side. The mixture should have drawn out poison. Yes, but the rate of healing defied natural law. She'd seen strong monarchs recover from similar wounds. It took weeks, not hours. The dragon's chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, each breath deep, and even despite the trauma its body had endured. Sera sat back on her heels, studying the creature in the firelight. Its scales were remarkable up close, crimson as fresh blood but threaded through with gold that seemed to shimmer when the flames danced. She'd never seen coloring quite like it. Her own dragon stirred beneath her skin, pressing forward with an insistence that felt foreign. For 2 years, that presence had been barely a whisper, a ghost of what it should have been. Now it paced restlessly, focused entirely on the massive creature occupying most of her cave floor. "What are you trying to tell me?" Sera asked the silent animal. "Important," her dragon seemed to whisper. "He is important." The word resonated through her chest, carrying weight she didn't understand. Important how? Important to whom? She was a rejected spark living in isolation. Nothing and no one was important to her survival except herself. Yet she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward this stranger. When she'd carried him through the storm, touching his scales had filled her with strength she'd never possessed. Even now, sitting beside him, she felt more whole than she had in years. As if some missing piece had finally clicked into place. The storm continued through the night and into the second day. Ash piled against the cave entrance, sealing it partially shut. Sera didn't mind. She had supplies enough for several weeks, and the forced isolation meant no unexpected visitors. Not that she received visitors anymore, but old habits of caution died hard. She spent the second day preparing more poultices and checking the dragon's wounds repeatedly. The improvement continued to astound her. By evening, several of the smaller cuts had closed completely, leaving only faint marks beneath the scales. The larger wounds still seeped, but even they showed remarkable progress. "Who are you?" she asked the unconscious dragon as she settled beside it for the night. The cave was small, barely large enough for her sleeping pallet, a work table, and the fire pit. With the massive dragon stretched across the floor, space was even more limited. She'd dragged her blankets down to sleep near the fire, telling herself it was practical. The dragon needed warmth to heal. It had nothing to do with the strange comfort she felt in its presence. She laid a hand on the dragon's shoulder, fingers tracing the ridge of scales. That same electric sensation sparked through her palm, traveling up her arm and into her chest where her own dragon responded with something that felt almost like contentment. Sera closed her eyes, letting the feeling wash over her. For the first time since her mother's death, she didn't feel entirely alone. Sleep claimed her gradually, pulled under by exhaustion and the warmth of the fire. She dreamed of flying through skies she'd never seen, of a voice calling her name in tones that made her heart race. The dreams felt significant, heavy with meaning she couldn't quite grasp. Dawn light filtering through the cave mouth woke her on the third morning. She opened her eyes slowly, consciousness returning in stages. The fire had burned low. She needed to add fuel. Her body ached from sleeping on the hard stone. Her hand still rested on scales that were warm and solid and not scales. Sera's eyes snapped fully open. Her hand rested on skin. Smooth, scarred skin stretched over muscle that tensed beneath her palm. She jerked back, scrambling away until her spine hit the cave wall. Where the dragon had been, a man now lay. He was massive even in human form, easily filling the space the dragon had occupied. Broad shoulders tapered to a lean waist, every inch of him built with the kind of strength that came from years of combat training. Scars crisscrossed his torso, old wounds that spoke of countless battles. His face, partially obscured by crimson hair that fell past his shoulders, was striking in its harsh beauty. A short beard covered his jaw, well kept despite his current state. Even unconscious and injured, he radiated the kind of power that made lesser dragons submit instinctively. A monarch, no question, but more than that. The aura rolling off him pressed against her senses with overwhelming force. This was no ordinary territorial monarch. This was something else entirely. Sera forced herself to breathe steadily, to think past the shock. Shifters transformed when unconscious sometimes, usually when their bodies decided the other form would heal faster. She'd read about it in her mother's journals, though she'd never witnessed it personally. The fact that this man had remained a dragon for 2 days before shifting suggested the animal form had been necessary to survive the initial trauma. She grabbed a blanket and covered him, averting her eyes from his nakedness even as heat crept up her neck. 2 years of isolation hadn't completely erased her sense of propriety. Once he was covered, she moved closer, checking his wounds with clinical detachment. Or trying to. Her hands trembled slightly as she peeled back the blanket to examine the injuries that had looked so severe on the dragon. In human form, they appeared even more deadly. Deep gouges across his ribs had barely closed. Puncture wounds dotted his shoulders and back. The smell of nightshade still clung to his skin, mixed with that metallic tang of iron. Someone had wanted him dead. Someone had used weapons specifically designed to kill shifters. As she cleaned the wounds with fresh water, the man stirred. His breathing changed, becoming rapid and shallow. A low sound escaped his throat, not quite a growl but close. His head turned restlessly, crimson hair falling away from his face. "No," he muttered, the word rough and barely intelligible. "Can't, won't let." Sera froze, her cloth hovering above his chest. He was delirious, caught in fever dreams. She should stay quiet, let him work through it. But curiosity and concern warred within her. "You're safe," she said softly, the first words she'd spoken to him as a man. "Rest." His eyes snapped open, and Sera's breath caught. They were molten gold, bright as the heart of a forge, and filled with a wild intensity that pinned her in place. For a moment, those eyes focused on her with perfect clarity. His lips moved, forming a word that seemed dragged from somewhere deep. "Flame match." Then his eyes rolled back, and unconsciousness claimed him again. Sera sat motionless, her heart pounding so hard she could hear blood rushing in her ears. Flame match. He'd called her flame match. The word resonated through her dragon, who surged forward with sudden fierce recognition. But that was impossible. She'd never met this man before. Flame matches didn't work that way. They required time, proximity, mutual recognition. Unless they didn't. Unless the stories she'd heard as a child were true, the ones about fated flame matches who recognized each other instantly, whose fires called to each other across distance and circumstance. She'd always thought those were fantasies, tales told to make young dragons dream of romance instead of facing the reality of political matches and flight alliances. "You're delirious," she told the unconscious man firmly, as if he could hear her. "You don't know what you're saying." But her dragon disagreed vehemently, pacing and pushing against her control with unusual strength. "Mine," it seemed to say. "Ours. Protect." Over the next hours, the man's fever worsened. He thrashed weakly, muttering words that made no sense strung together but painted a picture of betrayal and desperation. He spoke of poison and counsels, of enemies wearing friendly faces. The name Darius came up repeatedly, sometimes as a curse, sometimes as a plea. "Darius," he gasped during one particularly violent spell. "Get back, tell them, traitor in the..." His body convulsed, and Sera held him down, using the blanket to keep him from injuring himself further. She pressed cool cloths to his forehead, forced water between his lips when she could, and prayed to the scorching winds that he would survive. As the third day bled into the fourth, the fever finally broke. The man's thrashing subsided, his breathing evening out into true sleep rather than unconscious delirium. Sera sagged with relief, exhaustion pulling at her bones. She'd barely slept since finding him, too afraid that if she looked away for even a moment, death would claim him. The storm outside had finally quieted. Through the cave mouth, she could see pale sunlight struggling through settling ash. They were still partially sealed in, but the worst had passed. She should feel relieved. Instead, she felt trapped in a different way. Trapped by the presence of this stranger who called her flame match, who carried wounds that spoke of deadly enemies, who radiated power that made her dragon sing. "Who are you?" she whispered to the sleeping man. "And what have I brought into my home?" He didn't answer, but she hadn't expected him to. Tomorrow he might wake fully. Tomorrow she would demand answers. But tonight, as the fire crackled and the stranger's chest rose and fell with steady breath, Sera allowed herself to wonder if perhaps she'd saved him for a reason. If perhaps, against all logic and self-preservation, he truly was exactly what he'd called her. His flame match. Chapter 3. Cade woke to firelight dancing across rough stone walls and the scent of herbs he recognized from battlefield healers. His body ached with a bone-deep weariness that spoke of serious injury narrowly survived. For a moment, he simply breathed, taking inventory of wounds that should have killed him but somehow hadn't. The cave was small, barely large enough for basic necessities. A woman sat near the fire, her back to him, grinding something in a mortar with rhythmic precision. Dark brown hair fell in waves past her shoulders, catching auburn highlights in the flames. She was slight, her shoulders narrow beneath a worn linen tunic, but something about her presence filled the space. "You're awake," she said without turning, her voice quiet but steady. Cade tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through his ribs, and he fell back with a grunt that came out more growl than human sound. "Don't move yet." She turned then, and Cade found himself staring into gray-green eyes that held wariness and something else he couldn't quite name. "Your wounds are barely closed. You'll tear them open." He forced himself to remain still, though every instinct screamed at him to assess his surroundings, to prepare for threats. "How long?" "4 days since I found you. 3 since you shifted." She poured water from a clay jug into a wooden cup and approached cautiously, the way one might approach a potentially dangerous animal. "Can you sit enough to drink?" Cade managed to prop himself against the wall, accepting the cup with hands that trembled slightly. The weakness infuriated him, but he forced it down. Weakness invited attack, and he couldn't afford that now, not when enemies still hunted him. As he drank, she kept her distance, watching him with those careful eyes. She was younger than he'd first thought, early 20s perhaps, with the kind of face that might have been beautiful if it didn't look so guarded. A faint scar marked her left forearm, visible where her sleeve had rolled back. "I'm Sera," she said when he'd finished. "Sera Blackwood. And you are?" "Cade." He handed back the empty cup. "I owe you my life." "You do." No false modesty there, just simple truth. "What happened to you?" He'd known this question was coming, had prepared his answer during those brief moments of fevered consciousness. The truth was too dangerous, too complicated. She'd saved him, but that didn't mean she could be trusted with information that could topple kingdoms. "I'm a monarch," he said carefully, "from a territory south of here. I was attending a council meeting when someone poisoned the wine. Nightshade and iron, mixed in a way that would kill slowly." He touched his ribs where the worst wounds had been. "I shifted and fled before they could finish what they'd started." Sera's eyes narrowed. "The Ember Wastes are nowhere near any southern territories. How did you end up here?" "Instinct." That much was true. When you're dying and flying blind, you don't choose direction. You just fly. She studied him for a long moment, and Cade had the uncomfortable feeling she could see through his careful omissions. But she didn't press, merely moved to check his wounds with hands that were surprisingly gentle despite their calluses. "These are healing faster than they should," she said, peeling back the bandage on his ribs. "Even for a monarch. I've treated serious injuries before. This should have taken weeks." Cade looked at the injury himself and had to agree. Where there should have been raw flesh and oozing poison, he saw pink scars that looked days old rather than hours. Something about this place, about her, had accelerated his healing in ways that defied natural law. "Perhaps your herbs are better than most," he offered. "My herbs are the same ones every healer uses." She replaced the bandage with quick, efficient movements. "But I'm not complaining. The faster you heal, the sooner you can leave." The words held no malice, but they stung nonetheless. Cade's dragon snarled inside him, offended by the dismissal. This was their flame match. How could she want them gone? Because she doesn't know, he reminded himself. She doesn't feel what we feel. But that was a lie. He'd seen her expression when she'd touched him as a dragon, the wonder and confusion that had flickered across her face. She felt something. She just didn't understand what it meant yet. Over the following days, as his strength returned, they fell into an uneasy coexistence. The ash had settled enough to clear the cave entrance, but Cade remained, claiming he needed more recovery time. In truth, he wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Not when every moment near her made his dragon settle in ways it never had before. Sera told him about her life in careful, measured words that revealed more than she probably intended. She'd been rejected by her flight at 21 when her dragon failed to emerge properly during the awakening. The pain in her voice when she spoke of it made Cade's hands clench into fists. "They called me broken," she said one evening as they sat by the fire. "Defective. A spark who couldn't even shift properly wasn't worth the resources to keep." "That's not how sparks should be treated," Cade said, his voice harder than he'd intended. "They are essential to flight structure." I know what we're supposed to be." She cut him off. "Scouts. Messengers. The eyes of the flight. But that only matters if your dragon is strong enough to contribute. Mine wasn't. And after the rejection, my mother died. An accident, they said, but the timing was convenient." Her jaw tightened. "Then I was promised to Monarch Talon of the Ironscale territory. A political match to secure mining agreements. I'd met him once. That was enough. Cade had heard of Talon, a brutal monarch known for treating his flight like property rather than people. The thought of this woman bound to such a male made his dragon rage. You ran, he said. The night before the binding ceremony. Left everything behind. She stared into the flames. Including my brother. Garrett. He's 25 now, probably mated himself. He begged me not to go, said I'd die out here alone. A bitter smile crossed her face. He thinks I did die. Maybe part of me has. The pain in those words was palpable. Cade wanted to reach for her, to offer comfort, but he sensed she wouldn't accept it. Not yet. Does anyone from your flight know you're alive? He asked carefully. No, and I'd prefer to keep it that way. She met his eyes. You know anything about the Blackwood flight? Being a monarch from the south, you must hear news. Cade's throat tightened. He knew far more than he could say. But revealing that knowledge would expose his identity, and he wasn't ready for that conversation. Flight politics reach even into the Ember Wastes, he said instead. I've heard the name, but nothing specific about recent events. It wasn't quite a lie. More an omission. The distinction felt flimsy. On the 7th day, Cade made a proposal that changed everything. Let me help you, he said as they ate dried meat and flatbread. Your dragon isn't broken. It's suppressed. Trauma can do that, especially if the trauma happens during a vulnerable moment like the awakening. Sera set down her cup. What are you suggesting? Training. Let me see if I can coax your dragon forward properly. At her skeptical look, he continued. What do you have to lose? If it doesn't work, you're no worse off than you are now. She considered this for a long moment. And if it does work, if my dragon emerges fully, then you reclaim a part of yourself that was stolen. That evening, they went outside for the first time since the storm had begun. The ash had finally settled to occasional drifts, and the world lay covered in grey powder that crunched beneath their feet. Cade led her away from the cave to a small clearing where the ash was less deep. Close your eyes, he instructed. Stop thinking about what happened during the awakening. Stop thinking about what they said you were. Just feel. Sera obeyed, her breath visible in the cooling air. Cade moved behind her, close enough that his warmth touched her back but not quite making contact. He could sense her dragon now, a frightened creature huddled deep within, convinced it wasn't strong enough to exist. Call to her, he murmured near her ear. Not with desperation or fear. With certainty. She's yours. She's always been yours. For long minutes, nothing happened. Then Sera's body tensed, a gasp escaping her lips. Power rippled across her skin, visible as a shimmer in the air. Her form began to blur, bones shifting, muscles reforming. The transformation was messy at first, painful, but it completed. Where Sera had stood, a dragon now crouched. Smaller than Cade's dragon form but perfectly proportioned, with scales the same dark brown as her hair and those striking grey-green eyes. She looked at him, and in those eyes he saw wonder mixed with disbelief. He shifted then, letting his own dragon emerge. In this form, the flame-match bond sang even stronger, undeniable and overwhelming. He approached slowly, touching his snout to hers in the traditional greeting between dragons who recognized each other as flightkin. Mine, his dragon said. Ours. Protect. After several minutes, Sera shifted back, the transformation smoother this time. She stood naked in the ash-covered ground, steam rising from her skin, and looked at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. I did it, she whispered. I actually did it. Cade shifted as well, grabbing her cloak from where it had fallen and draping it around her shoulders before she could feel the cold. You were never broken. Just buried. She looked up at him then, and the walls she'd kept so carefully maintained cracked just slightly. How did you know? Because I've seen it before. Dragons don't fail. People do. He kept his hands on her shoulders, unable to make himself step away. You're stronger than they gave you credit for. Something shifted in the air between them. Awareness sparked, sharp and electric. Sera's pupils dilated, her breath catching. The flame-match bond pulled at them both, demanding acknowledgement, demanding acceptance. Cade, she said, but whatever she'd meant to say died as he lowered his head and captured her mouth with his. The kiss ignited something primal and fierce. Sera responded with a hunger that matched his own, her hands fisting in his hair as she pulled him closer. They barely made it back to the cave, stumbling through the entrance in a tangle of limbs and discarded clothing. That night, as the fire burned low and their breathing finally slowed, Cade held her against his chest and felt the flame match bond strengthen between them. Not complete, not yet, but growing, becoming real. Sera traced patterns on his scarred skin, her touch gentle despite the intensity they'd just shared. "This doesn't change anything," she said quietly. "When you're healed enough, you'll leave. I'll stay. That's how this works." But even as she said it, Cade felt her dragon protest. Felt the connection between them pull taut at the thought of separation. She felt it too. He could see it in the way her hands stilled on his chest, fingers splaying as if to hold him in place. "We'll see," was all he said, because the truth was too complicated and his secrets were still his own. For now, this was enough. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, wrapped in each other and the warmth of acknowledgement neither could quite voice, they had something resembling peace. Even if they both knew it couldn't last. Chapter 5. 3 days passed in a haze of indecision. Sera moved through her cave routines mechanically, checking her snares, tending the fire, preparing meals for one. But her mind remained trapped in the conversation with Cade, replaying his revelations and the impossible choice he'd left her with. The flame match bond ached constantly now, a hollow sensation in her chest that grew worse with each passing hour. Her dragon paced restlessly, whining for the connection they'd so briefly tasted. 10 days suddenly felt like an eternity. She was repairing a tear in her water bag when the first scent reached her. Foreign dragons. Multiple. Moving with purpose through the wastes toward her cave. Sera's heart slammed against her ribs. Cade had enemies. She'd saved him, nursed him, been seen with him for 12 days. Of course those enemies would come looking. The entrance to her cave darkened suddenly, blocked by bodies. 6 men filled the small space, all radiating the dominant energy of seasoned warriors. Mercenaries, she realized. The kind of dragons who sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. Sera Blackwood, the leader said, his voice rough as grinding stone. He was massive, scarred, with cold eyes that assessed her as little more than cargo. "You're coming with us." "I don't think so." Sera's dragon surged forward, stronger than it had ever been. For the first time in her life, she didn't hesitate. She shifted. The transformation came smoothly, power flooding through her as bones restructured and scales erupted across her skin. She was smaller than these males, but what she lacked in size she made up for in speed and desperation. The first mercenary who reached for her lost 2 fingers to her teeth. The second took claws across his face that would scar even after healing. Sera fought with everything she'd learned from years of survival, every lesson her mother had ever taught about finding weak points and exploiting them. But 6 against 1 was mathematics even courage couldn't overcome. When hands grabbed her wings and yanked, she went down hard. Iron chains materialized from somewhere, wrapping around her throat and forcing her back to human form with agonizing efficiency. "Feisty little thing," the leader commented, pressing his boot against her spine to keep her pinned. Cade said she was broken. "This one's got fire." Iron burned where it touched her skin. Sera gasped, her newly awakened dragon screaming in protest as the metal sapped her strength. They hauled her upright, securing chains around her wrists and ankles with brutal efficiency. "What do you want?" she managed through gritted teeth. "You, obviously." The leader grabbed her jaw, forcing her to meet his eyes. The dragon sovereign's flame match. Worth more than gold to the right buyer. Ice flooded her veins. They knew. Somehow, impossibly, they knew what she was to Cade. "I'm nobody's flame match," she spat. "You have the wrong woman." "Do we?" He laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Cade has spies everywhere. The moment that bastard sovereign crawled into the Ember Wastes half dead, we knew. The moment you carried him home and played healer, we knew. He released her jaw roughly. And the moment he left here 3 days ago looking like a lovesick drake, we definitely knew. They dragged her outside, where horses waited at the edge of the wastes. One of the injured mercenaries shot her a venomous look as he wrapped his mangled hand. "Bitch took my fingers." "Should have been faster," the leader said without sympathy. He lifted Sera onto a horse, securing her chains to the saddle with practiced movements. "We ride hard. 6 days to the capital." 6 days. Sera's mind raced. 6 days of travel meant Cade was already there, or would be soon. 7 days remained until he'd promised to send Darius for her answer. These mercenaries would deliver her to Kian before that deadline arrived. The journey began at a punishing pace. The iron chains made shifting impossible, stealing her strength and leaving her vulnerable in ways she'd never experienced. Every jolt of the horse sent pain lancing through her wrists where the metal bit into flesh. But worse than the physical pain was the hollow ache of the flame-match bond, stretched impossibly thin by distance and obstruction. Sera tried reaching for Cade through that connection, pushing desperate thoughts across the invisible thread that tied them together. Nothing, or almost nothing. She felt a flicker of something, a distant acknowledgement, but the iron wrapped around her blocked most of the signal. All she could transmit was fear and pain, no words, no location, no context. Just raw emotion screaming into the void. Did he feel it? Did he know she was in danger? Or did he simply sense her distress and attribute it to their separation? On the second day, one of the mercenaries rode close beside her. He was younger than the others, with a loose tongue loosened further by boredom and wine from his water skin. "Never thought I'd be transporting the Dragon Sovereign's flame match," he said conversationally. "Cade is paying triple rates for this job. Why does he want me?" Sera asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Leverage." The mercenary took another drink. "Kill a flame match, you kill the sovereign's strength. Flame match bonds aren't just romantic nonsense. They are power conduits. Break one half of the bond permanently, the other half becomes weak, vulnerable." He grinned. "Cade plans to force your sovereign to abdicate publicly in exchange for your life. Then he'll kill you anyway, weaken the bastard, and take the throne himself." Sera's blood ran cold. Not just her life at stake, but Cade's power, his throne, everything he was responsible for. "That's treason," she said quietly. "That's politics." The mercenary shrugged. "Cade has support. 2 territorial monarchs have already pledged their forces. When the Dragon Sovereign falls, they'll be rewarded with expanded territories and mining rights." 2 territorial monarchs conspiring with Cade. The conspiracy ran deeper than even Cade had suspected. Her mother had died trying to expose this corruption, and now Sera found herself trapped in the center of it. On the 4th day, the leader rode back to check on his captive. "You're holding up better than expected," he observed. "Most sparks would be broken by now." "I'm not most sparks." "No, you're not." He studied her with something almost resembling respect. "Cade said you were from the Blackwood flight. That true?" Sera's throat tightened. "It was. Long ago." "Then you might find this interesting." The leader's smile turned cruel. "Your brother sends his regards." The world tilted. "What?" "Garrett Blackwood. Now second to Monarch Riven of the Eastern Sands. One of Cade's co-conspirators." He watched her reaction with obvious pleasure. "He's been quite helpful actually. Told us all about your little coward's flight 2 years ago. How you abandoned him to face the flight's judgment alone. How he always knew you were weak." Sera couldn't breathe. Garrett, her brother, the one she'd mourned, the one she'd felt guilty about leaving, was second to one of the traitors. Voluntarily. By choice. "You're lying," she whispered. "Why would I lie? We'll reach the capital in 2 days. You'll see for yourself when he attends your execution." He spurred his horse forward, leaving Sera reeling. That night, chained to a scraggly tree while the mercenaries made camp, Sera closed her eyes and tried one more time to reach Cade through the flame-match bond. The iron dampened everything, but she pushed harder than before, ignoring the pain it caused. She felt him then, just for a moment. A flash of recognition, of desperate concern. He knew something was wrong. But could he find her? Did he even know where to look? "I'm here," she thought desperately. "I'm coming. I chose you. Please find me." Whether the message reached him or not, she couldn't tell. The bond flickered and faded, leaving her alone with her captors and the terrible knowledge of her brother's betrayal. 2 days remained until they reached the capital. 2 days until Cade would force Cade into an impossible choice. 2 days to figure out how to survive what was coming. Sera stared up at the stars through the sparse desert scrub and made a promise to herself. If she got out of this alive, if by some miracle she survived the conspiracy that had already claimed her mother's life, she would make sure every traitor paid for what they'd done. Including, if necessary, her own brother. The dragon inside her, no longer weak or broken, growled its agreement. Chapter 5. 3 days passed in a haze of indecision. Sera moved through her cave routines mechanically, checking her snares, tending the fire, preparing meals for one. But her mind remained trapped in the conversation with Cade, replaying his revelations and the impossible choice he'd left her with. The flame-match bond ached constantly now, a hollow sensation in her chest that grew worse with each passing hour. Her dragon paced restlessly, whining for the connection they'd so briefly tasted. 10 days suddenly felt like an eternity. She was repairing a tear in her water bag when the first scent reached her. Foreign dragons. Multiple. Moving with purpose through the wastes toward her cave. Sera's heart slammed against her ribs. Cade had enemies. She'd saved him, nursed him, been seen with him for 12 days. Of course those enemies would come looking. The entrance to her cave darkened suddenly, blocked by bodies. 6 men filled the small space, all radiating the dominant energy of seasoned warriors. Mercenaries, she realized. The kind of dragons who sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. Sera Blackwood, the leader said, his voice rough as grinding stone. He was massive, scarred, with cold eyes that assessed her as little more than cargo. You're coming with us. I don't think so. Sera's dragon surged forward, stronger than it had ever been. For the first time in her life, she didn't hesitate. She shifted. The transformation came smoothly, power flooding through her as bones restructured and scales erupted across her skin. She was smaller than these males, but what she lacked in size she made up for in speed and desperation. The first mercenary who reached for her lost 2 fingers to her teeth. The second took claws across his face that would scar even after healing. Sera fought with everything she'd learned from years of survival, every lesson her mother had ever taught about finding weak points and exploiting them. But 6 against 1 was mathematics even courage couldn't overcome. When hands grabbed her wings and yanked, she went down hard. Iron chains materialized from somewhere, wrapping around her throat and forcing her back to human form with agonizing efficiency. Feisty little thing, the leader commented, pressing his boot against her spine to keep her pinned. Cade said she was broken. This one's got fire. Iron burned where it touched her skin. Sera gasped, her newly awakened dragon screaming in protest as the metal sapped her strength. They hauled her upright, securing chains around her wrists and ankles with brutal efficiency. What do you want? She managed through gritted teeth. You, obviously. The leader grabbed her jaw, forcing her to meet his eyes. The dragon sovereign's flame match. Worth more than gold to the right buyer. Ice flooded her veins. They knew. Somehow, impossibly, they knew what she was to Cade. I'm nobody's flame match, she spat. You have the wrong woman. Do we? He laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Cade has spies everywhere. The moment that bastard sovereign crawled into the Ember Wastes half dead, we knew. The moment you carried him home and played healer, we knew. He released her jaw roughly. And the moment he left here 3 days ago looking like a lovesick drake, we definitely knew. They dragged her outside, where horses waited at the edge of the wastes. One of the injured mercenaries shot her a venomous look as he wrapped his mangled hand. Bitch took my fingers. Should have been faster, the leader said without sympathy. He lifted Sera onto a horse, securing her chains to the saddle with practiced movements. We ride hard. 6 days to the capital. 6 days. Sera's mind raced. 6 days of travel meant Cade was already there, or would be soon. 7 days remained until he'd promised to send Darius for her answer. These mercenaries would deliver her to Kian before that deadline arrived. The journey began at a punishing pace. The iron chains made shifting impossible, stealing her strength and leaving her vulnerable in ways she'd never experienced. Every jolt of the horse sent pain lancing through her wrists where the metal bit into flesh. But worse than the physical pain was the hollow ache of the flame-match bond, stretched impossibly thin by distance and obstruction. Sera tried reaching for Cade through that connection, pushing desperate thoughts across the invisible thread that tied them together. Nothing, or almost nothing. She felt a flicker of something, a distant acknowledgement, but the iron wrapped around her blocked most of the signal. All she could transmit was fear and pain, no words, no location, no context. Just raw emotion screaming into the void. Did he feel it? Did he know she was in danger? Or did he simply sense her distress and attribute it to their separation? On the second day, one of the mercenaries rode close beside her. He was younger than the others, with a loose tongue loosened further by boredom and wine from his water skin. Never thought I'd be transporting the dragon sovereign's flame match, he said conversationally. Cade is paying triple rates for this job. Why does he want me? Sera asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Leverage. The mercenary took another drink. Kill a flame match, you kill the sovereign's strength. Flame match bonds aren't just romantic nonsense. They are power conduits. Break one half of the bond permanently, the other half becomes weak. Vulnerable. He grinned. Cade plans to force your sovereign to abdicate publicly in exchange for your life. Then he'll kill you anyway, weaken the bastard, and take the throne himself. Sera's blood ran cold. Not just her life at stake, but Cade's power, his throne, everything he was responsible for. That's treason, she said quietly. That's politics. The mercenary shrugged. Cade has support. 2 territorial monarchs have already pledged their forces. When the dragon sovereign falls, they'll be rewarded with expanded territories and mining rights. 2 territorial monarchs conspiring with Cade. The conspiracy ran deeper than even Cade had suspected. Her mother had died trying to expose this corruption, and now Sera found herself trapped in the center of it. On the 4th day, the leader rode back to check on his captive. "You're holding up better than expected," he observed. "Most sparks would be broken by now." "I'm not most sparks." "No, you're not." He studied her with something almost resembling respect. "Cade said you were from the Blackwood flight. That true?" Sera's throat tightened. "It was. Long ago." "Then you might find this interesting." The leader's smile turned cruel. "Your brother sends his regards." The world tilted. "What?" "Garrett Blackwood. Now second to Monarch Riven of the Eastern Sands. One of Cade's co-conspirators." He watched her reaction with obvious pleasure. "He's been quite helpful actually. Told us all about your little coward's flight 2 years ago. How you abandoned him to face the flight's judgment alone. How he always knew you were weak." Sera couldn't breathe. Garrett, her brother, the one she'd mourned, the one she'd felt guilty about leaving, was second to one of the traitors. Voluntarily. By choice. "You're lying," she whispered. "Why would I lie? We'll reach the capital in 2 days. You'll see for yourself when he attends your execution." He spurred his horse forward, leaving Sera reeling. That night, chained to a scraggly tree while the mercenaries made camp, Sera closed her eyes and tried one more time to reach Cade through the flame-matched bond. The iron dampened everything, but she pushed harder than before, ignoring the pain it caused. She felt him then, just for a moment. A flash of recognition, of desperate concern. He knew something was wrong. But could he find her? Did he even know where to look? "I'm here," she thought desperately. "I'm coming. I chose you. Please find me." Whether the message reached him or not, she couldn't tell. The bond flickered and faded, leaving her alone with her captors and the terrible knowledge of her brother's betrayal. 2 days remained until they reached the capital. 2 days until Cade would force Cade into an impossible choice. 2 days to figure out how to survive what was coming. Sera stared up at the stars through the sparse desert scrub and made a promise to herself. If she got out of this alive, if by some miracle she survived the conspiracy that had already claimed her mother's life, she would make sure every traitor paid for what they'd done. Including, if necessary, her own brother. The dragon inside her, no longer weak or broken, growled its agreement. Chapter 6. The capital rose before them on the 6th day, a sprawling fortress city carved into volcanic rock. Sera had never seen anything so massive, so imposing. Black towers pierced the sky, their peaks disappearing into sulphurous clouds. Even from a distance, she could feel the concentrated power emanating from within those walls. Hundreds of shifters, maybe thousands, all gathered in one place. The mercenaries dragged her through streets crowded with merchants and soldiers, none of whom spared a second glance at the chained woman on horseback. In a city this size, misery was commonplace enough to be invisible. The palace itself was a monument to dominance. Massive gates opened into a courtyard large enough to hold an entire village. Guards lined the walls, their eyes tracking every movement with predatory focus. Sera's dragon whimpered beneath her skin, overwhelmed by the sheer concentration of dominant energy pressing down from all directions. They hauled her off the horse and through corridors of polished obsidian, past tapestries depicting ancient battles and conquered territories. The iron chains bit into her wrists with every step, but she forced herself to walk with her head high. Whatever happened next, she would face it on her feet. The throne room doors swung open, revealing a space so vast it took her breath away. Columns soared to a ceiling lost in shadows. Braziers blazed in iron sconces, casting dancing light across stone floors worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. And at the far end, raised on a dais, sat a single throne of black stone and iron inlay. The man occupying it was older than Cade, perhaps in his 50s, with silver threading through dark hair and cold eyes that assessed her with the precision of a merchant evaluating livestock. Cade. It had to be. The dragon sovereign's whore, he announced to the assembled court, his voice carrying effortlessly through the massive space. Captured in the Ember Wastes where she seduced our beloved sovereign during his moment of weakness. Murmurs rippled through the gathered dragons. Sera counted at least 50 present, all dressed in the finery of nobility or the leather of warriors. Power radiated from many of them. Monarchs from various territories gathered to witness whatever spectacle Cade had planned. "I am no one's whore," Sera said clearly, proud that her voice didn't shake. "I saved a dying dragon from the ash. That's all." Cade smiled, the expression holding no warmth. "Is that what you call it? How convenient that the dragon you saved happened to be the most powerful shifter in existence. How fortunate that he spent 12 days in your isolated cave with no witnesses to contradict whatever poison you dripped in his ears." "I poisoned no one." Sera met his eyes directly, refusing to cower. "But someone did. Someone who knew exactly what mixture of nightshade and iron would kill a dragon sovereign slowly enough for him to escape. Someone who had access to the royal flight's wine." The room went utterly silent. Cade's smile froze, then twisted into something uglier. "Careful, girl. Accusations against the acting regent require proof you don't possess." "Acting regent?" Sera's laugh was sharp. "Is that what you're calling yourself now that you think Cade is dead?" "The sovereign is," Cade began, but a voice cut through the throne room with undeniable authority. "The sovereign is very much alive." Every head turned. Cade stood in the doorway, flanked by a dozen armed dragons. He was dressed for battle, leather and steel replacing the simple clothes he'd worn at her cave. His beard was freshly trimmed, his crimson hair pulled back, and his golden eyes blazed with barely contained rage. He looked every inch the warrior sovereign, and the power rolling off him made several lesser dragons drop to their knees instinctively. Sera's heart slammed against her ribs. He'd come. Despite everything, despite the danger, he'd come for her. "Cade," Cade rose slowly from the throne. "We thought you dead. This is a joyous occasion. Save your lies." Cade descended into the throne room, his dragons fanning out behind him. Sera recognized the largest, a bronze-scaled man with warrior scars and shrewd eyes. "Darius, the second who'd helped Cade escape. I know what you did. I know about the poison. I know about the conspiracy." "You know nothing." Cade's facade cracked, revealing desperation beneath. "You have no proof of anything." "I have enough." Cade's gaze found Sera across the room, and something in his expression softened fractionally before hardening again. "Release her. Now." "I think not." Cade snapped his fingers. More dragons emerged from side doors, armed and ready. "You see, my sovereign, you've walked into a trap. You care for this broken spark. You'd do anything to protect her. So here's my offer: abdicate the throne publicly, name me your successor, and I'll let her live." "No deal." Cade's hand moved to the sword at his hip. "Let her go, or I'll take her by force." Cade laughed. "You're outnumbered. My dragons are loyal. They'll cut you down before you reach the dais." "Your dragons?" Darius's voice carried clearly. "Look again, traitor." As if choreographed, half of Cade's supposed supporters turned, weapons now aimed at their former allies rather than at Cade. The throne room exploded into chaos. Steel rang against steel. Dragons shifted mid-leap, scales and claws replacing human flesh in heartbeats. Sera tried to move, but the iron chains held her in place, forcing her to watch helplessly as violence erupted around her. Cade fought his way toward her, cutting through opponents with brutal efficiency. She'd seen him weak and fevered, vulnerable and honest. This was something else entirely. This was the dragon sovereign in his element, a warrior who'd earned his throne through strength and cunning. "The girl!" Cade shrieked. "Kill the girl!" A dragon broke from the melee, charging straight for Sera. She tried to shift, tried to defend herself, but the iron blocked everything. The dragon's jaws opened wide, going for her throat. Then Cade was there, intercepting the attack, ripping the enemy dragon's throat out with savage precision. He shifted back to human, blood staining his hands and chest, and began working at Sera's chains. "I've got you," he said, his voice rough. "I've got you. I felt your fear through the bond but couldn't pinpoint where. I'm sorry." "Behind you!" Sera screamed. Cade spun, but not fast enough. Cade's blade caught him across the ribs, opening a deep gash that immediately began bleeding heavily. Cade staggered, and Cade pressed his advantage, driving the sword toward Sera's chest. "If I can't have the throne, neither can you." Time seemed to slow. Sera saw the blade coming, saw Cade trying to intercept but too injured to move fast enough, saw her own death reflected in polished steel. The sword plunged into her abdomen, punching through flesh and muscle with agonizing precision. Pain exploded through her body, white-hot and all-consuming. She gasped, tasting copper, feeling warmth spread across her skin as blood poured from the wound. But beneath the pain, something else stirred. Deep within her core, where her mother's blood ran through her veins, power awakened. Not the dragon, not the shifter strength she'd so recently reclaimed. Something older. Something Kestrel had given her with her dying breath. Golden light erupted from Sera's hands, so bright it illuminated every corner of the throne room. The chains holding her shattered, melting away like wax before flame. The sword in her gut glowed white-hot, forcing Kian to release it with a scream. Sera wrapped her hands around the blade still embedded in her flesh and pulled. It came free in a spray of blood and light. The wound beneath, mortal and gaping, began to close. Flesh knit together at impossible speed, skin sealing over muscle, until nothing remained but smooth, unbroken skin and a tunic soaked in her own blood. What is this? Kian stumbled backward, terror replacing triumph. What are you? My mother's daughter, Sera said, and her voice carried power that made dragons cower. Kestrel knew you'd killed her. She knew, and before she died, she performed a ritual. She gave me her gift, amplified it, and hid it so deep I wouldn't discover it until I needed it most. She moved toward Kian, light still streaming from her palms. Around the room, the battle had paused, all eyes on the spark who glowed like a fallen star. You took my mother, Sera said. You tried to take my flame match. You've killed innocents and betrayed your sovereign for nothing but power. Her hands rose, golden light intensifying. No more. But before she could act, Cade was there. His hand closed around Kian's throat, lifting the traitor off his feet with contemptuous ease. This death is mine, Cade said quietly, and snapped Kian's neck with a single, brutal motion. The body crumpled to the floor. The remaining conspirators, seeing their leader fall, dropped their weapons and surrendered. The battle was over in heartbeats, the throne room suddenly still except for the heavy breathing of survivors and the groans of the wounded. Sera turned to Cade, her power still crackling across her skin. He was bleeding badly, his wound deep enough to be serious even for a dragon sovereign. Without thinking, she pressed her glowing hands to his ribs. The light flowed from her into him, carrying healing with it. His flesh knit together beneath her palms, the gash closing as quickly as her own wound head. Around the room, injured loyalists gasped as that same healing light touched them, mending cuts and broken bones with effortless precision. When it finally faded, when the last wound was closed and the last pain eased, Sera swayed. Cade caught her before she could fall, holding her against his chest. Easy, he murmured. That took a lot out of you. I'm fine, she lied, though exhaustion pulled at her bones. Did we win? We won this battle. Darius approached, his expression grim. But messengers just arrived. The 2 territorial monarchs who backed Kian have already mobilized their forces. We've got armies marching on the capital from both east and west. Cade's arms tightened around Sera. Then we prepare for war. Chapter 7. The weeks that followed were a blur of steel and strategy. 2 territorial monarchs had indeed marched their armies toward the capital, emboldened by Kian's promises of expanded power. Monarch Riven of the Eastern Sands and Monarch Vex of the Western Crags commanded nearly 3,000 dragons between them, seasoned fighters who'd been promised territories and mining rights for their loyalty to a dead traitor. Sera found her place in the chaos not as a warrior, but as something more vital. Her healing gift, dormant for 23 years before awakening in that desperate moment, proved invaluable. When skirmishes broke out along the borders, she rode with Darius's scouts, her hands glowing golden as she mended wounds that would have claimed lives. The soldiers looked at her with awe bordering on worship. The broken spark who'd been rejected by her flight now held the power of life in her palms. She heard their whispers, felt their reverence, and understood for the first time what her mother must have experienced. To heal was to hold someone's existence in your hands and choose to preserve it. The responsibility was staggering. You're doing well, Cade told her one evening as they reviewed battle plans in the war room. Maps covered the table, marked with positions and supply lines. The troops trust you. That matters more than you realize. I'm not a sovereign's mate yet, Sera said quietly. I'm just the dragon sovereign's flame match. There's a difference. Is there? His golden eyes held hers. You've saved more lives in 3 weeks than some mates do in lifetimes. You've earned their loyalty through action, not title. The flame match bond between them had strengthened daily, a constant awareness of each other's presence that both comforted and distracted. They hadn't completed the binding yet, both too occupied with survival to focus on ceremony. But Sera felt it pulling at her, demanding acknowledgement, demanding completion. The decisive battle came on a grey morning when both enemy armies converged on the capital simultaneously. Cade had anticipated the coordination, positioning his forces to create a trap that would catch the attackers between loyal troops and the city walls. The fighting lasted 3 days. Sera moved through the battlefield like a spirit of mercy, golden light streaming from her hands as she touched soldier after soldier. Gaping wounds closed. Broken bones knit. Exhausted warriors found new strength. She pushed herself beyond reason, beyond safety, until Darius physically carried her from the field when she collapsed from exhaustion. By the third sunset, both enemy monarchs had been captured. Their forces, seeing their leaders in chains and facing a dragon sovereign who commanded loyalty through strength rather than coercion, surrendered. The war was over before it truly began. The public trials were held in the throne room, every territorial monarch summoned to witness justice. Sera stood beside Cade's throne, no longer chained and helpless but present as his acknowledged flame match. When the guards brought in Monarch Riven, her breath caught. Behind him, also in chains, walked Garrett. 2 years hadn't changed her brother much. Still handsome, still carrying himself with that careful confidence that had always made Sera feel inadequate by comparison. But there was something hard in Garrett's expression now, something bitter that hadn't been there before. Their eyes met across the throne room. Garrett's widened in shock, clearly not expecting to see the sister he'd believed dead. Then his expression shuttered, going carefully blank. "Garrett Blackwood," Cade announced, his voice carrying easily through the assembled crowd. "Second to the traitor Monarch Riven. You stand accused of conspiracy against the throne and providing intelligence to our enemies. How do you answer?" "Guilty." Garrett's voice was steady. "I served Riven of my own will. I supported his claim. I harbor no regrets." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sera stepped forward, unable to remain silent. "Why?" The word came out hoarse. "You were my brother. You begged me not to leave. You said you'd be alone." "Alone?" Garrett laughed, the sound sharp and cutting. "I was always alone, Sera. Do you know what it was like growing up in your shadow? Poor, broken little Sera who couldn't shift properly. Mother spent every spare moment trying to fix you, teaching you herbs and healing because you couldn't be a proper dragon. I was strong. I was everything our flight valued. But did I receive any of that attention? No. It was always you." The words hit like physical blows. Sera had never known, never suspected. "When you ran," Garrett continued, his chains clinking as he gestured, "I was blamed. Your failure became my shame. The flight said I should have stopped you, should have convinced you to accept your duty. They punished me for your cowardice. So you joined a conspiracy to murder the dragon sovereign." Sera's voice hardened. "You helped traitors because you were jealous. I joined powerful dragons who saw my worth." Garrett's composure cracked. "Riven offered me respect, position, the life I deserved. He promised that when Kian took the throne, we would rule the Eastern Sands with complete autonomy. For the first time in my life, someone wanted me for who I was, not who I could never be. And now?" Sera asked. "Was it worth it?" Garrett's expression twisted with something ugly. "At least I didn't spend 2 years hiding in the wastes like a coward." "No, you spent them plotting treason." Sera's voice remained steady despite the pain lancing through her chest. "I fled an abusive match. You chose betrayal. Those aren't equivalent." She turned to Cade, aware that every eye in the room watched them. "I have no brother. The boy I knew died the day he chose ambition over loyalty. Do with him what you will." "Sera, please." Garrett's voice broke, tears suddenly streaming down his face. "I'm still your brother. I'm sorry. I was angry. I wasn't thinking clearly. Please, you can't let them kill me." The manipulation was obvious, the tears calculated. Sera recognized it because she'd seen Garrett use the same tactics as a child to avoid punishment. Some things never changed. "Exile," Sera said to Cade. "Send them both beyond the scorched mountains. Let the waste that sheltered me become their prison. Let them survive on their own, with nothing but each other and the ash." Cade studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "So be it. Monarch Riven and his second are hereby exiled beyond the northern borders. Any who give them aid or shelter will face the same fate. Take them away." As guards dragged Garrett from the throne room, he screamed curses and pleas in equal measure. Sera watched impassively until the doors closed, then allowed herself one shuddering breath. "Are you all right?" Cade asked quietly. No, she admitted. But I will be. The binding ceremony was held that same evening. Sera had expected something simple, a formality to acknowledge their bond. Instead, she found herself dressed in a gown of deep crimson that made her skin glow, her hair braided with golden thread, standing before every monarch in the Seven Wastes. Cade wore ceremonial armor, black steel inlaid with gold runes that caught the firelight. He looked every inch the warrior sovereign as he took her hand before the assembled crowd. I claim this woman as my flame match, he announced, his voice carrying power that made lesser dragons bow their heads. Sera Blackwood, daughter of Kestrel the Scout, survivor of rejection, keeper of the ancient gift. She is mine by choice and destiny both. Any who challenge this binding challenges me. Silence. No one dared speak against the dragon sovereign. Do you accept? Cade asked her, his golden eyes holding hers. I accept, Sera said clearly. I claim you as my flame match, Cade, dragon sovereign of the Seven Wastes. I choose you freely, completely, for as long as we both live. The flame match bond flared between them, visible as crimson light that wrapped around their joined hands. The crowd gasped, but Sera barely heard them. All she felt was the connection solidifying, becoming unbreakable. That night, in chambers sealed against intrusion, Cade completed the binding. His teeth sank into the juncture of her neck and shoulder, the bite both pain and pleasure so intense Sera cried out. The flame match bond snapped fully into place, tying them together in ways that transcended physical connection. Afterward, as they lay tangled together, Sera traced the matching mark on Cade's shoulder where she'd bitten him in return. No regrets, he asked softly. None, she said, and meant it. This is where I belong. Outside their chamber, guards stood witness that the binding was complete. Inside, the dragon sovereign and his mate began their life together, bound by choice and fate in equal measure. Chapter 8. 6 months had passed since the binding ceremony, and the capital barely resembled the blood-stained battlefield it had been. Sera stood at the window of her private study, watching ash drift gently over the city below. Winter had returned to the kingdom, but this time it brought peace instead of war. The changes had been gradual but profound. The Royal Flight Council, once a gathering of only the most dominant monarchs, now included representatives from every rank. 3 sparks sat on the council, their voices heard and respected for the first time in living memory. The decision had shocked the traditionalists, but Cade had been adamant. If my mate can save hundreds of lives and help win a war, no one can tell me sparks lack value, he declared during the first Reformed Council meeting. The argument had ended there. Sera's healing network had spread across all 7 territories. She'd found her mother's journals hidden in the palace archives, decades of research and knowledge that Kestrel had painstakingly documented. Using those notes, she'd trained 50 healers in the basics of the craft, though none possessed her gift for instant regeneration. Still, they saved lives daily with herbs and skill, and that was enough. She touched her abdomen absently, feeling the slight swell that had appeared over the last few weeks. The discovery had been both thrilling and terrifying. A child, an heir to the throne, a small life that would inherit both Cade's strength and her healing gift, if the old texts about such things could be trusted. You're thinking too loudly, Cade said from the doorway. He'd shed his formal armor for simple leather and wool, looking more like the man she'd nursed in her cave than the sovereign who commanded armies. I can feel your worry through the bond. I'm not worried, Sera lied. Liar. He crossed the room, wrapping his arms around her from behind and placing his hands over hers on her stomach. Tell me what troubles you. Everything, she admitted. Nothing. I don't know. 6 months ago I was alone in the wastes, convinced I'd die there. Now I'm mate to the dragon sovereign, carrying the heir to 7 territories, responsible for the lives of thousands. Some days I still feel like that broken spark who couldn't shift properly. But you're not her anymore. Cade's breath was warm against her ear. That girl died in the ash when she chose to save a dying dragon instead of herself. The woman who took her place is stronger than she knows. Pretty words, Sera said, but she leaned back into his embrace. True words. He turned her to face him, his golden eyes serious. You want to go back, don't you? To the cave. She shouldn't have been surprised he knew. The flame match bond made hiding emotions nearly impossible. Just for a few days. Before winter makes the journey too dangerous, before my duties make leaving impossible. I need to see it again, to remember who I was before all this. Then we go. Cade kissed her forehead. Tomorrow. Just you and me, like it should have been from the start. They left at dawn with minimal escort, just Darius and 2 guards who would remain at the base of the wastes while the royal couple continued alone. The journey took 3 days by horse, retracing the path Sera had walked when carrying Cade through the ash storm. The cave looked exactly as she'd left it. Small, rough, isolated. But standing before it now, Sera felt no shame at its simplicity. This place had kept her alive. It had sheltered her when she had nowhere else to go. It had been the site of her transformation from victim to survivor. "It's smaller than I remembered," Cade observed, dismounting. "I can't believe you carried me 8 miles to this place." "I can't believe it either, honestly." Sera pushed open the entrance, breathing in the familiar scent of stone and dried herbs. Everything remained where she'd left it. The work table, the sleeping pallet, the fire pit still containing ashes from that last morning. The flame match bond gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. They spent the afternoon cleaning and preparing the cave for habitation. Cade gathered firewood while Sera swept and aired out blankets. There was something peaceful about the simple domestic tasks, a reminder that beneath the crowns and titles, they were just 2 people who'd found each other in impossible circumstances. As evening fell, they sat by the fire Cade had built, sharing dried meat and flatbread from their packs. Outside, ash began to fall again, thick flakes that quickly obscured the darkening wastes. "Another storm," Sera murmured, watching through the entrance. "Appropriate." Cade pulled her closer. "This is where our story began. In a storm, with you defying logic and nature to save me. I didn't know what you were then. Didn't know saving you would change everything." "Would you have left me if you'd known?" he asked. Sera considered the question seriously. "No. Even then, my dragon recognized something. I couldn't have walked away any more than I could have stopped breathing." They made love that night with the tenderness of dragons who knew each other completely, not the desperate passion of their first joining but something deeper and more profound. Afterward, Sera lay with her head on Cade's chest, listening to his heartbeat and feeling their child stir faintly within her. "Tell me honestly," she said into the comfortable silence. "Do you regret it? Choosing a flame match who came with so much complication? A spark rejected by her own flight, whose brother turned traitor, whose existence nearly cost you your throne?" "Never." His answer was immediate and fierce. "You saved my life twice. Once in the ash, and once when you gave me a reason to keep fighting instead of simply surviving. Before you, I was a sovereign. Respected, feared, obeyed. But I wasn't alive, not really. I was simply going through the motions of existence. And now I have everything." His hand splayed across her stomach protectively. "A flame match who challenges me. An heir on the way. A kingdom at peace. This is what I was meant for, Sera. Not just ruling, but living." She tilted her head to kiss his jaw. "I love you. I don't think I've said that enough. You show it every day." Cade's smile was visible even in the dim firelight. "But I like hearing it too." They spent 3 days at the cave, cut off from the world by ash and choice. They hunted together in dragon form, their scales contrasting beautifully against the grey landscape. They talked about plans for their child, about reforms they wanted to implement, about simple dreams of a future they'd build together. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm cleared enough for travel. Sera stood in the entrance one last time, memoizing details. The rough stone table where she'd treated Cade's wounds. The sleeping pallet where they'd first admitted what they meant to each other. The fire pit that had kept them both alive through 12 crucial days. "We'll come back," Cade said, understanding her reluctance to leave. "This will always be our sanctuary. When court politics become unbearable, when the weight of crowns grows too heavy, we'll return here and remember." "Remember what?" Sera asked. "That before we were sovereign and mate, we were just 2 broken people who saved each other." He took her hand. "Come. Our kingdom awaits, but this place will always be here." They rode down from the wastes as ash continued to fall gently around them. Sera looked back once, seeing the cave disappear into the grey, and felt no sadness. She was leaving, yes, but not fleeing. She would return, and that made all the difference. The journey back to the capital took 4 days. When they arrived, the city greeted them with celebration. Word had spread about the mate's pregnancy, and dragons lined the streets, cheering and roaring their approval. Sera waved to them, feeling the weight of responsibility but no longer fearing it. That night, standing on the balcony of their chambers with Cade's arms around her and their child growing within her, Sera watched Ash fall over the capital and thought about how far she'd come. From rejected spark to mate. From broken to whole. From alone to beloved. "What are you thinking?" Cade asked. "That I'm not afraid anymore," Sera said honestly. "Of Ash, of the future, of who I am. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I belong." "You are." His hands settled over her stomach where their child rested. "You're home." And he was right. Not the cave in the wastes, not the palace with its throne and politics, but here, in his arms, with their child between them and a kingdom to build together. This was home. This was where she belonged. Ash continued to fall, blanketing the world in grey, but Sera no longer saw it as something to fear or survive. It was simply another season in a life that had become more than she'd ever dreamed possible. She had been broken, rejected, alone. Now she was claimed, cherished, powerful. The journey from one to the other had cost her family, innocence, and the illusion of safety. But it had given her everything that mattered: purpose, love, and the courage to face whatever came next. Cade pressed a kiss to her temple. "Ready to go inside, my mate?" "Ready," Sera said, and meant it in every possible way. Together they turned from the ash-filled night and walked back into their chambers, into their future, into the life they'd chosen and claimed for themselves. Behind them, winter painted the world grey. Ahead, whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. And that, Sera thought as sleep claimed her in her flame matcher's arms, was more than enough.